Throughout history, numerous events and moments have raised eyebrows, especially when viewed through photographs lacking context. We're diving into a collection of the most peculiar and fascinating images, ranging from snapshots of the most influential figures to the most astonishing inventions. Here are 20 extraordinary historical photographs that will leave you speechless and you must need to see. Number 20. FBI Fingerprint Files Databases. This is one of the reasons why computers are so helpful. Need a recipe? That's easy to navigate. Create a document where you can search for a dish or a keyword in a second. Need to organize your photos? Make a digital copy and correctly title them, and you'll find each image in less than 5 clicks. Need to pull up a customer or a patient file? Easy, just use a computer to look their name up. So then, what did people do before the digital age? Well, you're looking at what they did. You're looking at the FBI's Fingerprint Files Division. Established in the early 20th century, it became the world's largest collection of fingerprints by the time computers started to make their mark in the 1970s. This division had millions of fingerprint records, and so a system needed to be established to access these fingerprints. The process was quite arduous and thorough. The fingerprints were classified, sorted, and stored in massive filing cabinets that occupied entire floors of the FBI building. Each fingerprint card was meticulously indexed by various characteristics using a system known as the Henry classification system. The system, developed in the late 19th century, allowed for the categorization of fingerprints into broad groups based on patterns like loops, whorls, and arches. Yes, it's as complicated as it sounds. When a new fingerprint came in, workers would manually search through the relevant sections of the filing system to find a match. This required an incredibly detailed knowledge of the classification system and a sharp eye for patterns. The workers, many of whom were women, became exceptionally skilled at quickly sifting through thousands of cards to pinpoint the one they needed. It was a painstaking and time-consuming process, but these workers were remarkably efficient at handling thousands of match requests daily. However, when computers were introduced, these workers were then replaced. Today, the integrated automated fingerprint identification system and its successor, the next-generation identification system, can search millions of records in a fraction of the time it once took. History is pretty weird. Number 19. Bed for 1 for 4 pennies. Today's rentals and Airbnbs can easily cost around $150 per night. That's the bare minimum. But the most lavish ones could cost hundreds of dollars. But did you know that in the past, people could find a place to sleep for the night for just 4 pennies? You're looking at it right now. These beds, were the standard for the lowest-earning people in 19th century London. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, London became a melting pot. The world was brought to London, and many sought fortune in the city, including the poorest of the poor. Naturally, collapse followed, as London could only house so many people. Then came the 4-penny coffin. For 4 pennies, a person could rent a place to sleep for the night in a coffin-shaped box. These were narrow, coffin-like boxes where the poorest of London's poor could lay their weary bodies. But hey, it wasn't all bad. The price also included access to a kitchen to cook their meals, and sometimes even a cup of tea or coffee in the morning. For those who didn't have even a single shilling to spare, this seemingly harrowing condition was already a good deal. Well, this is just another grim part of history. Number 18. No canine left behind. Now, you're probably wondering who the woman in this photo is. Well, she was one of the most renowned animal advocates in Europe. Born in Middlesbrough in 1895 as Kate Ward, she became known as Camberley Kate and grew to have an immense love for animals. It all began when she saved a dog in 1943, and this fateful encounter sealed Kate's purpose. Kate dedicated her life to pushing a handmade 2-wheeled cart down the streets of the United Kingdom. Every waking day was dedicated to rescuing stray dogs. By her death in 1979, she took in and cared for at least 600 dogs, but she also cared for several felines. Naturally, it didn't take long for her to become a familiar and beloved sight in Camberley, England. Despite the sheer number of dogs she was taking care of, Kate never forgot each and every story of the animals. Not only did she provide them with food and shelter, but she also advocated for leash laws and dog rights. Her fame spread far and wide, capturing attention in the national press, on television, and even across the Atlantic. Many wanted to help strays through Kate. Food, blankets, and funds soon poured in support of her cause. It didn't take long for her to widen her reach and help more dogs in need. She continued her service until she died in 1979. She lived a long life, until the age of 84, and up until her last moments, she was surrounded by the dogs whose lives she had transformed. Her legacy didn't end with her final breath. as she inspired many people to help animals in need throughout her entire life. Number 17. Garden hermits. Before garden gnomes and other garden decorations were considered trendy, people in the early 18th century used something else to decorate their lawns. But that's a person right there in the photo. Well, yes, that's exactly what people in the 18th century used, or at least those who had enough money used. Predominantly in England, garden hermits are people who lived in specially built hermitages, grottos, caves, or rockeries on the estates of wealthy landowners, not just as recluses but as living, breathing garden ornaments. Meant to embody ideals of solitude and simplicity amidst nature, their role was to remain in the garden permanently, where they would be cared for, fed, and sometimes consulted for advice or viewed for entertainment by guests. What do we think about this? I know some of you might think of this as a decent means of making a living, but leave your opinions in the comments down below. Now, you're also probably wondering just where this practice originated. Well, it all began in the early 15th century. It was when figures like François Petrarch lived as a hermit on his father's estate and later became a confidant to King Charles VII of France. The trend gained momentum in England during the Georgian period, merging Enlightenment ideals with the traditional Hermetic lifestyle. These hermits were seen as representations of the aspirations for a simple rural life. I know it sounds odd, but that's how people were back then. By 1727, the first known garden hermitage was established in England by William Stukeley. This marked the beginning of the trend of garden hermitages. Quite interesting, don't you think? Number 16. The golden age of air travel. If you're a frequent flyer, then you've most likely had a bad experience on the plane unless you fly business or first class, that is. I've had my fair share of not necessarily bad moments, but rather mildly discomforting or infuriating experiences. The person in front of me leaning their seat all the way down, making my face an inch away from the screen. Unbelievable. Food that I reserved before the flight. And while these could probably have been prevented had I shelled out more money for first-class seats, let's face it, who has the money for that in this economy? But did you know that in the 1950s, considered the golden age of air travel, flights were more of an experience than a simple means of getting from point A to point B? I mean, just take a look at these photos. Back then, people were dressed to the nines in suits and dresses. Plane cabins were spacious and decked with glamorous interiors. This was an era where legroom was more than generous, and the idea of having to pay extra for a window or aisle seat would have seemed absurd. Flight attendants, then known as stewardesses, catered to passengers' every need with a smile. Instead of soda and other snacks, gourmet meals were served on fine china, even in economy class. However, air travel was much more expensive back then, and it was an experience that only a few could afford, with tickets costing up to 5 times more than they do today when adjusted for inflation. I know, unbelievable, right? Not to mention the planes back then. Let's just say that our planes today are not only quicker but immensely safer. The introduction of jet engines in the late 1950s revolutionized air travel, slashing flight times in half and making the world much smaller. The Boeing 707 and the Douglas DC-8, the first commercial jetliners, promised speed, comfort, and efficiency, ushering in a new era of aviation. Transatlantic travel doesn't take you 3.5 days today, so I guess there's a downside and an upside to everything. Number 15. Century Old Selfie. Yes, you're looking at a mirror selfie captured sometime around 1920. Quite interesting, don't you think? It seems like people in the past knew to be creative with their photos, just not as frequently as we do today. This makes perfect sense considering that back then, cameras were bulky and film was expensive. But really, how did selfies even become a thing? The concept was first believed to become popular around the early 2010s. Keyword popular. It was believed that the very first selfie was taken in 1839 when Robert Cornelius, a pioneer in photography, took a photo of himself standing in the back of his family store in Philadelphia. Cornelius had to sit still for minutes, not milliseconds, to capture his portrait. For decades, self-portraits were the realm of artists with paint and canvas or photographers with bulky equipment and the knowledge to use it. Fast forward to the 2000s, and the advent of digital cameras and cell phones equipped with front-facing cameras changed self-portraits to selfies. Today, capturing a photo of oneself wasn't just for the technically skilled or artistically inclined. It was for everyone, anytime, anywhere. Even so, seeing photos like this feels more precious, don't you think? Number 14. HCHO. This photo doesn't show a dog. It shows an eternal friend and a family member. The dog in this photo is HCHO. If you already know who he is, you know the drill. Grab some tissues for the heartwarming and bittersweet story behind this image. In the 1920s in Tokyo, Japan, a professor at the University of Tokyo adopted HCHO in Aoyama. Every day, Hachiko would accompany his owner to the Shibuya train station, where Professor Ueno would catch his train to work. This went on for years until 1925. One fateful day, Ueno passed on at work. He never returned home by train again. But for Hachiko, the only time he would return home was when his owner stepped foot out of the train station, but Ueno never did. Instead of returning home, however, Hachiko stayed. He waited and waited and waited. He returned to the station at the same time the next day and the day after that, and continued to do so, not for days, not for weeks, not months, but for the next 9 years, hoping that the next day his owner, his friend, would finally walk home with him again. Hachiko's unwavering loyalty captured the hearts of the local residents and station workers. They began to take care of him, providing him with food and water as he kept his vigil. In 1935, Hachiko passed on, but he continues to live in people's hearts to this day. In fact, he was immortalized by his statue in front of the Shibuya station, where he continues to wait for Ueno. But who knows, perhaps they met a long time ago when Hachiko took his last breath in 1935. Perhaps by now, the two are already in the afterlife, never to be separated again. Number 13. Seconds before happiness. Throughout history, human and animal companionship has always been apparent. Take, for instance, this heartwarming photo titled, "Seconds Away from Happiness." A young boy moments away from meeting his new best friend. Adorable. If you're as moved by this moment as I am, let's keep the conversation going. Share your own stories of surprise and joy in the comments below. Number 12. The most brilliant minds on the planet. Take a look at this photo. How many people can you recognize? If you're wondering, this is a real, unedited photo captured in 1927. Albert Einstein, Marie Curie, Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, and other esteemed scientists and inventors who catapulted the scientific field gathered at the Solvay conferences, where this photo was captured. You see, these conferences were meant to be a time for scientists to discuss and present their projects or ideas. The fifth conference is by far the most iconic. This conference was particularly significant because it centered on the newly formulated quantum theory. The discussions that took place during this conference were intense, with towering figures like Einstein and Bohr debating the very nature of reality. Einstein, famously skeptical of quantum mechanics' probabilistic nature, made his iconic statement, "God does not play dice with the universe." Bohr, on the other hand, defended the strange and counterintuitive predictions of quantum mechanics. Now, about that photo, the 1927 Solvay conference photo is nothing short of legendary. It captures 29 of the most brilliant minds on the planet, including 17 Nobel laureates, all in one shot. Marie Curie, the only woman in the photo, stands out not just for her gender, but also for her groundbreaking work in radioactivity, which earned her 2 Nobel Prizes. Number 11. A beach trip during the Victorian era. What you're looking at right now are bathing machines. Yes, you heard that right. These machines were meant for washing on the beach in the 18th and 19th centuries. Men and women mingling on the beach in swimwear was considered taboo. The solution? These wooden huts on wheels about the size of a garden shed. This hut was essentially a changing room on wheels, designed to be rolled into the sea. The idea was that you'd enter the machine on the beach, change into your bathing attire, which was often more fabric than most modern-day wardrobes, and then be wheeled out into the water. Luckily, today there's no need for these bulky and unnecessary huts. Number 10. The linked hands. This might look like an ordinary photo of a statue, but it isn't. This is the linked hand statue. This statue, more accurately described as 2 gravestones, shows the religious divide between Colonel JCPH of Aon and noblewoman Van Gorkum. You see, in the 19th century, the Dutch lived with pillarization, which means that public establishments separated individuals by religious and political affiliation. Unfortunately, this couple had different religions, with Colonel Aon being a Protestant while Van Gorkum was a Catholic. Naturally, their marriage was a scandal at the time, especially in 19th century Netherlands. The Protestant husband died first, and then Van Gorkum. Despite their differences, they wanted to be buried alongside each other, but it was impossible due to pillarization. And just as they jumped hurdles to get married, they found a loophole to be together too. Number 9. PostMortem Photography. Did you know one of these people is dead? Back then, this was the norm, taking photos with dead people. Postmortem photography began in the early days of photography, around the 1840s, becoming particularly widespread during the Victorian era. At a time when photographs were a luxury, a postmortem photograph often served as the only visual remembrance of the deceased. The practice might seem morbid or unsettling to us now, but back then, it was viewed through a different lens, no pun intended. Death was a much more present part of everyday life, and these photographs were a way to address and cope with the loss. The deceased were often posed to appear as if they were merely sleeping or, in some cases, even standing with the help of props or family members, creating an almost lifelike image. Families would dress their loved ones in their finest attire, sometimes including favorite toys with children or personal items that held significance. As time marched on and photography became more accessible, the practice of postmortem photography gradually faded. Changes in attitude towards death and mourning, along with advances in medical science reducing mortality rates, saw the practice diminish through the 20th century. Number 8. Female samurai. Samurai. This is a word that we often encounter, not only in anime but also in movies and shows, from Western to Asian media. But what are they, really? Well, you're looking at one right now. Originally, samurai were a prominent military class in Japan during the 12th century, amid the turmoil of the country's feudal period. Not only were they skilled in fighting and wielding swords, or better yet, katanas, but they valued virtues like loyalty, honor, and self-discipline. Samurai served the daimyos, the powerful landowners, pledging their loyalty in exchange for land or position. Now, you see, most people, if asked to imagine a samurai, would conjure a Japanese male wielding a katana in their hands. However, there were female samurai, too, better known as onabugeisha. These women were trained in the art of war, often to protect their homes and families without their warrior husbands. They wielded a variety of weapons, from the naginata, a long pole with a curved blade, which was considered the weapon of choice for many of these women, to the kaiken, a small dagger used for close combat. Despite their prowess and contributions to their clans, the stories of female samurai were often overshadowed by their male counterparts. However, recent research and interest in women's history have brought their stories to light, revealing their significant role in Japan's feudal society. Number 7. IBM Hard Drive. If you told people in the 1900s that you could access thousands of photos and multi-page documents using a small square that weighs 2 grams, they probably wouldn't believe you. This thing might look like a speaker or an actual computer, but that thing is just a hard drive. Yes, you heard that right. That's just the hard drive. In 1956, IBM unveiled the IBM 305 RAMAC, which stands for Random Access Method of Accounting and Control. This massive box was the world's first commercially available hard disk drive. This hard drive was housed in a cabinet as big as 2 refrigerators, weighing in at over a ton. Yes, you heard that right, a ton. It was so large that it had to be moved with forklifts and installed with cranes. Now, you might be asking, at that size, it must have a ton of storage, right? Yeah, that's the thing. This colossal machine had a storage capacity of 5 megabytes. That's right, 5 megabytes. To put that into perspective, the photo you just snapped on your smartphone is probably larger than the entire storage capacity of this behemoth. Even so, the RAMAC changed the game by introducing the concept of random access storage, allowing data to be retrieved directly from any point in the storage medium. This revolutionary idea paved the way for the modern computing era. What was the cost of leasing a RAMAC system? Around $3,200 a month, which is roughly equivalent to about $30,000 in today's money, and companies were lining up for the privilege because the value it brought to data management and business operations was unprecedented. Who would have thought that today 1 terabyte of storage space is possible on a small chip? Number 6. Knocker-up in London. Have you ever wondered what people used before alarm clocks? Well, there were people for that. Yep, you heard that right. You see, in the Victorian era, until the early 20th century, London people worked as knock-ups. A knock-up's job was exactly what it sounds like. These were the human alarm clocks of their time, tasked with waking up people in time for work. Armed with long sticks, batons, or even pea shooters, knock-ups would roam the streets during the early hours, tapping on windows or knocking on doors to rouse sleepers from their slumber. Waking up for school and work is challenging for most of us, much like how you subscribe to your favorite newsletter or service. These knock-ups were employed through long-term agreements, but it's not as easy as it sounds. If you know just how difficult it is to resist that snooze button, you'd understand the challenge these knock-ups faced. The rise of affordable alarm clocks and changing working patterns eventually rendered the knocker-up profession obsolete. This is just one example of a job being replaced by modern machines. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. This rare historical photo will leave you speechless, and you need to see what you're looking at. It is allegedly a creature captured in the forest of South America. The exact location where this creature was found remains unknown. Well, with the quality of the photo, this might as well be a fake figure created to start a hoax. You see, in the early days, it was common to create hoaxes. Case in point, the Fiji mermaid was actually a taxidermy abomination created to gather money. I wouldn't be surprised if this alleged Yeti was made similarly. However, there have been times in history when real creatures like the dodo were believed to be fake when they were actually real. Well, I'll let you be the judge on this one. Number 5. Dinosphere. No, this isn't from a comedy or a contemporary film. This is the Dinosphere, invented in the 1930s by Dr. J.A. Purves. The Dinosphere was a futuristic take on personal transportation that looked quite comical. It's a giant wheel, about 10 feet in diameter, with a driver sitting inside, navigating this behemoth along the beach or down the road. Yes, from inside the wheel. That's 1930s engineering for you. Dr. Purves was inspired by the idea of creating a vehicle with minimal rolling resistance, but I reckon he took it to the extreme. The Dinosphere was essentially a monowheel, with a driver and engine housed within a single large wheel circumference. Even so, it was pretty fast, at least faster than the average walking speed of a person. This wheel reached up to 30 miles per hour. Considering you're basically in a giant metal donut, that's pretty impressive and terrifying. The Dinosphere came in a couple of versions, one powered by a petrol engine and another that ran on electric power, showcasing Dr. Purves' commitment to innovation. Unfortunately, despite its novel design and the attention it garnered, the Dinosphere had drawbacks. Balancing was a challenge, especially at higher speeds or on uneven terrain. Plus, the lack of lateral stability meant turning was, well, an adventure. Imagine navigating a giant wheel through city traffic or around tight corners. It wasn't exactly practical. Actually, it was rather unsafe. But who knows, perhaps this design could be refined to create something actually usable. Number 4. First photograph ever taken. Of course, this video won't be complete without this photo. But I can hardly recognize anything in this photo. Well, that's probably because this is the oldest, or rather the first photograph ever taken. You see, in 1826 or 1827, in a small French town, a man named Joseph Niepce made history. Niepce, a curious inventor and a true pioneer in the field of photography, was experimenting with a technique that would forever alter the course of visual documentation. Niepce's invention, heliography, was a process that involved coating a pewter plate with a light-sensitive substance called bitumen of Judea, which hardens upon exposure to light. This meant that the brighter parts of the image would harden on the plate, while the unexposed areas would stay soft and could be washed away, leaving behind a permanent image. Now, imagine Niepce setting up his camera obscura, a simple box with a tiny hole that projected the outside world onto a surface inside the box, in the window of his upper-story workroom. He pointed it out towards a rather unassuming view. The rooftops of buildings, a distant tree, the skyline, nothing out of the ordinary, just a slice of everyday life. But what makes this so extraordinary is that this view would become the subject of the world's first photograph, known as View from the Window at Le Gras. The exposure time, not seconds, not minutes, but hours, actually days. Reports suggest the exposure lasted at least 8 hours, and some say it could have been several days. The result was a grainy, yet unmistakably real representation of a moment frozen in time. It was the first successful attempt to permanently capture an image from nature using a camera and chemicals. This photograph, while not visually stunning by today's standards, marked the beginning of the photography era. Number 3. Tubas. No, that's not a massive megaphone. This is a photo of a massive war tuba. Yes, you heard that right. In the early 20th century, aircraft played a large role on the battlefield. After all, this was the height of World War I. The only efficient way to detect planes back then was to use these massive cones. At a time when radar was yet to be invented, people had to get creative. These war tubas were essentially large acoustic locators used by several countries, including Japan and Britain, to detect the sounds of approaching planes. The principle was simple. Sound travels through air, and by catching and amplifying these sounds, operators could potentially hear enemy aircraft before they were visible. Back then, it was pretty common to see a group of soldiers operating these massive horn-like instruments, pointing them towards the sky in search of the faint hum of an enemy plane's engine. Some versions were so large they needed to be mounted on vehicles, while others could be operated by hand. The operators would use headphones attached to the tuba to listen closely for any indication of incoming aircraft, giving military forces a chance to prepare anti-aircraft defenses. But how effective were these war tubas? Well, in their time, they were part of the cutting-edge technology for air defense. In ideal conditions, these acoustic locators could indeed pick up the sound of an airplane from several kilometers away. However, their effectiveness was limited by several factors, including background noise, weather conditions, and the increasing speed and altitude at which aircraft could fly. As you can imagine, the introduction of radar technology in the late 1930s and early 1940s quickly made war tubas obsolete. Radar could detect aircraft far more reliably at greater distances and under almost any condition, rendering the acoustic locators practically museum pieces by the end of World War II. Number 2. Cincinnati Library. Is anyone in the audience from Cincinnati? If you are, then perhaps this might interest you. This photo was captured in the Cincinnati Library before it was demolished. Seems like a paradise for bookworms, right? Well, not quite. Opened in 1874, the library was built after a Victorian architecture, with its Gothic revival style that made it stand out as a landmark in Cincinnati. Its most striking feature was the main hall, a breathtaking atrium filled with cast iron bookstacks. It sure does look like a great place to spend time in, or to do your research. Unfortunately, by the 1950s, the library was deemed outdated and unsafe. With that, the demolition of the building began in 1955. Number 1. National Selfie Day in Space. Speaking of selfies, did you know that Buzz Aldrin took a selfie of our entire planet back in 1966? Yep, you heard that right. In November 1966, Buzz Aldrin, on the Gemini 12 mission, took a photo in space. This program was about testing out space travel techniques that would pave the way for the Apollo mission to the moon. Aldrin, alongside his commander, Jim Lovell, is orbiting the Earth, and amidst conducting groundbreaking experiments and spacewalks, Aldrin decides to snap a photo. How? Well, he used a Hasselblad camera with a 70mm film magazine. This gadget is a high-quality, specially modified camera made to withstand the harsh conditions of space, and it's bulky, especially with those space gloves on. So, this might as well be among the hardest selfies in history.